November 1888, Alabama. Somewhere between two stations on a line that the Southern Express Company had begun routing its most valuable shipments along because the other lines had been robbed too many times and the company had run out of lines that felt safe. The train slowed in the darkness. The express agent inside the car heard it. The specific change in the locomotive's rhythm that meant something on the track had forced the engineer's hand. He was on his feet before the train stopped. Not because he knew what was coming, because he had been on enough of these runs, had heard enough of the depositions his colleagues had been giving to the company investigators over the preceding 2 years, to understand that a train stopping in the dark between stations in Alabama in 1888 was a train that deserved his full attention. The door came open. He came in from the night, the way he always came in, unhurried, rifle up, the lamp catching the planes of a face that the wanted posters had been trying to reproduce for 2 years, with the crude tools available to them and never quite capturing. Rube Burrows, 34 years old, Lamar County, Alabama, former farmer, current fugitive, the most wanted man in the American South. He looked at the agent. The agent looked at the rifle. Burrows said something quiet, something that witnesses across multiple robberies consistently described as conversational rather than threatening, the tone of a man stating terms he considered reasonable rather than demands he expected to enforce. Open the safe. Put the money in the bag. Nobody has to have a bad night. The agent opened the safe. Later, giving his deposition to the company investigators, he struggled to articulate what had been most unsettling about the encounter. Not the rifle. Although the rifle was present and accounted for and had been held with the steadiness of a man who had been holding rifles since he was old enough to walk behind a plow in Lamar County, Alabama. Not the demands, which had been straightforward and unambiguous and left no room for misunderstanding about what was required. It was the calm, the specific, absolute, working calm of a man who was doing something he had done before and expected to do again, and who had arrived at a point in his relationship with the enterprise where the anxiety had been replaced by the professional focus of someone at work. Not a desperate man. Not a man who had run out of options and was making his last available choice in the dark with shaking hands. A man who had made a decision about how to live and was living it with the specific competence that practice produces in people who practice long enough. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been building a file on that calm for 2 years. 2 years of depositions from express agents who described the same quality in the same terms. 2 years of informant reports from the Alabama and Mississippi communities, where Burrows had grown up and where his roots ran deep enough that the agency's attempts to cultivate the information network that would eventually produce a location had been producing frustration instead. 2 years of a file growing thicker while the distance between the file and the man it described stayed stubbornly, infuriatingly fixed. He had not started as the most wanted man in the American South. He had started as a farmer in Stephenville, Texas, with a wife and children and the specific respectability of a man trying to make the arithmetic of agricultural life in the 1880s produce an outcome that the arithmetic of agricultural life in the 1880s was not reliably producing for anyone. He had moved from Alabama to Texas in the late 1870s with the same hope that moved tens of thousands of young Southern men west in those years. The hope that the problem was location rather than condition, the different ground would produce different results, that the specific insufficiency of what he had left behind was a local phenomenon rather than a systemic one. The ground in Texas was different. The results were not sufficiently different. December 1886. The Texas and Pacific Railroad, a train near Bellevue, Texas. Rube Burrows and his brother Jim, with guns in their hands and a plan that had been assembled from the specific knowledge of a man who had been watching how the railroads moved their money and had arrived at a conclusion about how that money could be redirected. $300. That was the yield from the Bellevue robbery. $300, less than a year's income for a working farmer. more than a month's income for a railroad worker, enough to make the calculation that had produced the robbery look like a reasonable one from the specific vantage point of men who had been making unreasonable calculations about agricultural income for long enough that the comparison was not as alarming as it should have been. $300 was the price of everything that followed. What followed was a career. Not the improvised, desperate, one robbery at a time career of the opportunistic criminal that the dime novel tradition had established as the standard outlaw biography. A methodical, geographically strategic, operationally consistent career of express car robbery that moved through the Southern rail network with the planning of someone who had studied the system he was working against and understood it well enough to select his locations, his timing, and his escape routes with the attention that planning deserves when the consequence of inadequate planning is capture. Jim was taken in December of 1887, Montgomery, Alabama. Pinkerton agents moving through the network of people who knew the Burrows family until they found the specific node in that network that produced the location. Jim died in prison in 1888. Tuberculosis. Quiet. Final. The disease that had been operating in the background of his life, rendering its verdict with the indifference that disease brings to the moral complexities of the lives it terminates. Rube kept working. Partners came. Partners were taken or disappeared or proved insufficiently reliable for the specific demands of extended fugitive existence, in a region where the faces on the wanted posters were the faces of men whose families still lived in the surrounding counties. He worked alone when he had to. He worked with whoever the circumstances provided when circumstances provided someone. He robbed the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. He robbed the Mobile and Ohio line. He robbed the Southern Express Company enough times that the company's investigators had developed a file on him thick enough to constitute a substantial document of what it looked like to pursue a man with conviction and patience and considerable institutional resources and consistently fail to close the distance. The press made him famous. Not with his cooperation. Burrows does not appear to have cultivated his own legend with the self-consciousness that certain frontier outlaws brought to the project of their own mythology. The press made him famous because the railroad companies were unpopular, and the rural South had a long tradition of measuring its feelings about unpopular institutions through its response to the people who robbed them, and Burrows was providing the kind of consistent, competent, unapprehended robbery that the tradition rewarded with the specific affection that communities reserve for the man who is doing what many of them have felt like doing and getting away with it. He was reportedly philosophical about the getting away with it. He told associates in the years of his running that he intended to continue until he was caught or killed and held no preference between the outcomes. The statement made the newspapers. The newspapers made it sound like bravado, the theatrical defiance of the romantic outlaw performing his own legend. The men who heard him say it described it differently. They described a man who had calculated his options honestly and arrived at a genuine conclusion rather than a performance. A man who had been running for 3 years and had lost his brother and his partnerships and any realistic possibility of the ordinary life he had been trying to build before December of 1886, and who had looked at what remained available to him and made a clear-eyed assessment of where it ended. He was right about where it ended. He was just not right about when. October 7th, 1890. Linden, Alabama. Marengo County. A small town. The kind of town that men moving through the surrounding countryside used as a supply and social node. A place to purchase what the rural existence required. Conduct the business the rural existence generated. Be seen by people who understood what seeing you in Linden in October of 1890 might be worth to the right party. Burrows was recognized. The recognition produced the response that recognition of a man carrying a reward on his head produces in people who understand the arithmetic of reward money against the arithmetic of agricultural income in rural Alabama in 1890. A man named Jesse Hildreth was involved in the confrontation that followed. The accounts of exactly what happened and in what sequence, carrying the inconsistencies that accounts always carry when the people providing them have interests in what the record will say. What every account agrees on is this: Rube Burrows was shot and killed in Linden, Alabama on the 7th of October, 1890, 36 years old, 4 years and 10 months after the Bellevue robbery. Roughly $3,000 in express company money after the Bellevue robbery. One brother dead in prison. The Pinkerton file closed. The most wanted man in the American South returned to the Alabama ground he had come from in 1854, 36 years later, in a county not far from the one that had first produced him. The express agents who gave their depositions across the years of his career consistently returned to the same detail when the investigators asked them to describe the man. The calm. The specific, working, professional calm of a man at work on something he had decided to do, and was doing with the competence that decision and practice together produce. It was, every one of them agreed, the most unsettling thing about the encounter. Not the rifle, not the demands, not the darkness outside the car windows, or the distance from any help, or the specific helplessness of a man alone, with a safe that the man on the other side of the rifle wanted opened. The calm. Because the calm said something that the wanted posters and the newspaper coverage and the Jesse James comparisons had all been circling without quite landing on. That the man they were dealing with was not desperate, not impulsive, not driven by the kind of wild-eyed frenzy that the outlaw tradition had taught them to expect, and that would have been, paradoxically, more manageable than what they were actually facing. He had chosen this, deliberately, methodically, with full awareness of what the choice cost and what it offered and where it ended. He had chosen it, and he had worked it, with the calm of a man at peace with his choice. And the ground at Linden, Alabama, that received him on the 7th of October, 1890, received a man who had been exactly what the calm suggested he was. From the first stop train in the Texas darkness to the last October afternoon in a small Alabama county seat where the recognition finally arrived and the preference he had declared turned out not to matter, the ground received him. The calm went with him. And the express cars of the American South ran a little quieter after that, for a while. Just for a while.